Issei Sagawa died on November 23rd, 2022, ending one of the most infamous escapes from justice in recent memory. Sagawa spent over 30 years being interviewed as a celebrity and film star, was never convicted nor sent to prison. Despite the fact he murdered and ate a woman in France in 1981, cannibalism he freely admitted to. This is the story of how Sagawa escaped. Issei Sagawa was born on April 26, 1949 in the Hyogo prefecture of Japan to a wealthy family, a fact which would become the deciding factor in his fate. His grandfather was the editor of one of Japan's big four newspapers. His dad was an industrialist. However, he was born prematurely and ill with an intestinal disease and grew up a sickly small introvert, losing himself in a world of books. He lost himself more than people normally do, and he later said his desire to eat human flesh first manifested when he was 7, over a male schoolmate's thigh. He had sex with his dog, and his cannibalistic desires grew as he grew older too, turning towards women. Where did this desire to eat human flesh come from? We don't know for certain. It's a dodgily researched area with strange people, but much has been made of the subtle influence of a game his father and uncle used to play with Sagawa and his brother. The 20th of September 2007 issue of New Criminology contains an account which I will read for you. There was an uncle, Mitsuo, who at the traditional New Year's festivities often disguised himself as a frightening boy-eating giant. Dressed to look like a monster, he would chase the scurrying children, pretending he wanted to devour them. Little Issei and his elder brother were the recipients of the horrible giant's attention, and it was up to their father, Akira Sagawa, the knight quite literally in shining armour, to appear as their saviour. The boys whooped and yelled hysterically as the giant, making hungry giant noises, dashed around the house in pursuit. Strangely, each time the game was played, the giant would always emerge the victor, first blinding and then slaying the gallant knight Akira. The children would then be snatched up and taken away, ready for the giant's equally sizable cast-iron cooking pot. Issei Sagawa later recalled the giddy mixture of terror and elation he felt as he and his brother were lowered, struggling wildly, into the stew pot. The game was profoundly enjoyed by both boys and had a deep and lasting effect on Issei. Quite. Hansel and Gretel became a story with a special meaning for him, but the children were cooked instead of saved. Sexual desire and the need to eat a person became one and the same. To be fair to 15-year-old Sagawa, he called a psychiatrist for help, feeling that if left unchecked he would kill and eat someone. The expert said he could only be helped if he came in person. They would not do anything over the phone for Sagawa. This was too much for the painful introvert with his guilty conscience, and he ended the cry for help. To be fair, modern mental health services don't offer much better support. He tried speaking to his brother, but was laughed at again, not an unusual issue. Instead, Sagawa leaned into his desires and gave up guilt. He decided that one day he would kill. He managed to get through time at 2 universities, earning a master's degree in Shakespearean literature, but disaster struck at Araki University, Tokyo. Aged 24, he acted on his cannibalistic impulses and became fascinated by a German woman because she was taller than he was and fitted his characteristics of beauty. She thought she was teaching him German. He trailed her back to her flat, broke in through a window, intending to cut the flesh of her behind, but it brought no knives or tools, and he looked for some. She woke up in time and knocked him down. Sagawa was arrested, but the police had no way of knowing about the hunger to consume flesh, so they charged him with attempted rape. This would have been the best chance to stop Sagawa if he'd been locked up for life here, but his family paid off the victim and left Sagawa able to carry on free. Sagawa confessed how he felt to a psychiatrist who deemed the client dangerous, but this too was smoothed over with money. There were no other major incidents until Sagawa moved to the Sorbonne in France to study for a PhD. In a video interview with Vice, which is still on the internet and allows you to see Sagawa closely debating the events covered in this, he remarks on how his mother was afraid something awful would happen. As he says, I left Tokyo on April 26th on my 28th birthday. I went to Paris to study comparative literature. I was at the gate with my passport in hand. My mother had an extremely sad look on her face, as if she knew something horrible was going to happen, her motherly instincts filled with apprehension. But again, no one acted to stop Sagawa. Sagawa was now 27 and obsessed with murdering and eating someone. He confessed later to bringing prostitutes home almost every night with the intention to kill them, but found himself unable to pull the trigger on his gun. Weirdly, during Sagawa's time in Paris, one of his celebrity crushes killed herself just round the corner to him, and he became high on the fantasy of being the person who found her body. Sadly, this freezing up would end on June 11th, 1981. Now 32, Sagawa was still at the Sorbonne, still obsessed with European women, and he became fascinated with his classmate, Vinnie Hartwelt. He fell into his form of twisted desire from the moment they first met, and he forced himself to overcome his shyness to try and make the bond he needed. He would talk to classmates, play along with jokes, and the two formed a friendship. They would go to art and literature exhibitions. Sagawa saw an opening with Hartwelt, who needed money. He asked if the multilingual woman would help him if he paid for his schooling, and he invited her over for dinner and poetry translation. Just as the previous victim was involved with helping him with German, so would Hartwelt. He had, of course, no intention of doing the poetry. Hartwelt was another woman, much taller and fitter than Sagawa, who felt small and inferior. At 4'9", he was dwarfed by the 5'10" woman. He wanted to ingest her beauty and strength. She arrived, but he proved unable to make the move to kill her. He asked her again. She came round, and as she sat reading, he took the rifle from the cupboard and pointed at her from behind. He credits a bout of food poisoning for making him even more unhinged, and pulled the trigger, but the gun jammed and he put it back, and they carried on, with Hartwelt unaware. Yet the desire to eat her got bigger, and he knew that if this carried on they'd become true friends and he'd never be able to do it. Well, that's his words. He asked her out again. This time, could he record her on tape giving a performance of the poem? The Dutch woman arrived. Sagawa slipped whiskey into her drink and they talked. Sagawa made a sexual approach to her, asking if they could become lovers, but she said no, they were friends, and for Sagawa that seemingly settled the issue. He asked her to perform the poem she started reading, and he shot her in the neck with a .22 rifle. He later claimed he'd passed out at this point and awoke to find her body, and he then started doing what he'd always dreamed of. He bit into her, but found the skin tough and a fruit knife didn't help. So he went out to the market to get a bigger knife. Then he had sex with the corpse, carved her up, 8 parts of her, cooked and ate other parts and put more in the fridge. In one of my books, I quote at length an interview with Sagawa. He goes into detail about all this, including his assessment about how different parts of the body taste, but it's so far beyond YouTube's terms of service we'll skip it here. He slept with the body overnight, copulating often, and photographed the whole process. A day later, with the body now decomposing, Sagawa used a hatchet to put what remained of Hartwelt in 2 suitcases. In a later interview, Sagawa explained how, before his time in Paris, he'd been on a cruise in Greece, had dinner with a butcher who'd also been cruising, and he spent the meal jovially explaining to a rap Sagawa how to cut up meat. A year after the murder, he wrote the butcher a letter, thanking him for the lesson he now used. Next, he went to dump the cases in a lake. He called a cab and was dropped off at the park. A slight man, he was struggling with 2 heavy suitcases, and he passed a couple who looked at him suspiciously. So he tried to hide the cases, but it was no good. The couple looked in the cases, the police were called, and the police began to speak to every taxi driver to see if they'd picked up a Japanese man that day. 2 days later, Sagawa was arrested. He knew they would find him, he just thought they'd do it quicker. He didn't try to run. There was no doubt Sagawa had committed the murder and eaten the body. He instantly admitted that she was in the fridge. He told the police he was done killing. This one murder meal had washed away all his obsession. The police weren't going to take that chance. However, his family hired an enormously expensive defence lawyer, and then followed one of the most unbelievable chain of events in modern crime. After a 2-year period being held ready for trial, a French judge deemed Sagawa insane, unfit for trial, partly because of Sagawa's detailed and obviously enjoyed accounts of the killing, and ordered him placed indefinitely in an asylum for the criminally insane. 3 psychiatric assessors said Sagawa would never be cured. Sagawa hated the asylum, not wanting to mix with people he considered mad. Instead, he started to write, and people in Japan began to take notice. The writer, Inihiko Yamamoto, spoke to Sagawa and published a mixture of confession and narrative called In the Fog, which became hugely famous. Then Paris Match, the legendary magazine, published the crime scene photos of the butchered corpse, leading to seized copies and an arrest. The French government, growing annoyed at having to look after Sagawa, the fame he was getting and the complaints he hadn't gone to a trial, coupled with Sagawa's father working on a plan, meant France deported Sagawa back home to Japan to be committed to a psychiatric hospital in Tokyo. Here, his father's money still flowing, they paid to have him assessed and judged sane. He was just a sexual pervert, but, and it's a huge but, the charges in France had been dropped, as Sagawa was meant to be in an asylum for the rest of his life. The court documents had been sealed and were not sent to Japan, and Japanese authorities thus had low legal reason to keep him locked up. So on 12th of August 1986, Sagawa was able to discharge himself and leave, a free man, which is what he remained for the rest of his life. Naturally, this came in for some criticism. Sagawa did not try and blend into a quiet life for the next 10 years. He was a celebrity speaker, often commenting on the gory details, answering questions on what human flesh tastes like. If you're wondering, no smell or taste, and melted in my mouth like raw tuna. He wrote books, appeared in films, and Spar magazine employed him as a restaurant critic. Songs were written about him: The Stranglers' La Folie in 81, The Rolling Stones' Too Much Blood in 83, and Human Factors Lab's song Dinner with Renee in 2004. He played lead roles in porn recreations and sold new paintings. At one point, someone paid him to take part in the film's recreation of Little Red Riding Hood. He was the wolf. By his death, he'd written over 20 books and created an explicit manga of the murder. He was still a fantasist, however, and began to say his proper end should be being consumed by a European woman. Sometimes Sagawa would say he didn't need to eat anyone else, and others he would still say he felt the desire, such as when he played up for a Vice interview by trying to get their readers to apply to him to be eaten. However, around the turn of the millennium, things changed. Sagawa had fewer opportunities. His parents died and he was banned from the funeral. The debts left him with no inheritance. He had to go into benefits. He found difficulty now getting any further employment. He began to regret not the murder, but having to live a life where everyone knew him as a murderer. He tried to explain this in a Vice video interview. My life will never get better. It would have been much easier to die. I really wish they would give me the death sentence. Death is my only hope. Recently, more than the urge of eating someone, I have the urge to be killed. I want to die suffering slowly, torn apart alive. And this was all just fetish too, as he continues. Of course, I'd rather be killed by a beautiful woman than a man. In 2013, he started to have cerebral brain hemorrhages and needed daily care, living with his brother. But he could still become the centre of attention. As recently as 2017, he was the sole subject of a documentary from previously acclaimed filmmakers. Called Cannibal, it essentially allowed him to ramble on for the whole length of the viewing. At worst, and most often, the 30-year-old interest in Sagawa was simply legal snuff of people interested in death titillation. At best, was he offering all an insight into what people could become? The team behind Cannibal mused as cannibalism was a long-standing subject of anthropological inquiry. Once common across the prehistoric world, is this the repressed preternatural longings of all of us? Well, that's what they say. But no, nice try. This is not a callback to our genetic past. This was simply pure insanity. Sagawa died from pneumonia on the 24th of November 2022. He was 73, out of prison. His family held a private funeral.